If you're watching, please like and subscribe. It is really great to have JJ Bola here today talking about his new book, Mask Off, Masculinity Redefined. Firstly, hello. Good to see you.
How you doing, Owen?
I'm all right. I'm all right.
Yeah.
Finally clawing our way through to some form of normality. It is a bit cold to be drinking outside, as I've discovered. I don't know how you're feeling.
Yeah, I'm not going outside for a while. Everyone's talking about alfresco dining. I'm just like, no, I'll stay in my home. Thank you.
It's like we're all suddenly like pigeons all of a sudden sitting outside grazing.
Yeah.
Let's just start. I want to kick off with something you talk about in your book, and I just think it's quite a good way in. And it's about back in May 2014, a young male university dropout at Santa Barbara City College. He killed 3 of his male flatmates and then released this 100,000 word manifesto, and then went on a shooting spree and killed 3 women and injured 14 more. Just tell us a bit about that. And what does that whole horrific, obviously a horrendous incident, what does it tell us about masculinity?
I mean, really, it's kind of the unfortunate perfect symbol of male entitlement, really. So here is a young man who felt like in his life he was supposed to be granted certain positions, certain opportunities, and certain access to women and women's bodies, but he wasn't able to have that, and so the frustration built up increasingly, and to the point where it resulted in violence, and very much specific targeted violence. And a lot of this was fueled by what's known as like the incel community, which, you know, is largely like what's the involuntary celibates, where it's like a group of men and a lot of like people online who have this culture of entitlement and feel like they're not getting the things that they typically deserve in life. And that is a lot of like, that's due to their toxic male entitlement. And I think this was like one of the ways in which it manifested in the most extreme sense, but actually it manifests every day in very little ways as well.
When we talk about toxic masculinity, what are we talking about? What do we mean? Because a lot of the time, some men hear that and think, "Well, this is just this is an attack on men. It's demonizing men. I can't help the way I'm born," and that kind of stuff. So, what are we talking about with toxic masculinity?
I mean, it's really simple. It's just the behaviors that are basically reinforced or endorsed by a patriarchal society that grants men certain privileges, but on the other hand, you know, is oppressive towards women. So say, for instance, a man, you know, thinking it's a man's duty or right to be able to sleep with many women and be sexually promiscuous. If a woman's seen in the same way, then that's usually a positive for a man, but it's usually a negative for a woman. And so that's just like an example of toxic masculinity. Or male aggression. You know, a man being kind of physically dominant or aggressive is usually seen as a trait that's reinforced within the patriarchy, but for a woman, it's a negative aspect. So it's really just the typical kind of traits and behaviors that are endorsed by the patriarchy, and this varies in different ways all over the world. There's some things that's very similar, and it's very common everywhere, but there's some things that's also very different and changes according to the world and the culture.
When we, I mean, a lot of this is devil's advocate, obviously, but it's important. Some men will go, "Oh, we say that men are privileged and everything's rigged in their favor," but look at the suicide rates. The biggest killer of men under 45 in Britain is suicide. Men are far more likely to die of suicide than women are. Where does that fit into the theory, that the theories, the thesis of the book?
I mean, and there's so many other things as well. Men are more likely to die by suicide. Men are more likely to be homeless. So 90% of homeless people on the streets are male. Male also more likely to be substance abusers or have addictions. And all of these are actually like reinforcements of what is kind of patriarchal expectations. And so this is kind of what I say in terms of like the patriarchy and toxic masculinity, is that it's a double-edged sword. For the majority of men, the same system that gives you privileges is also the same system that oppresses you. And the problem is that as men, we often see what grants us privileges without necessarily seeing where like the negative effects that it's having on us. And so I think that we have to look at it quite critically as well, in terms of how we are kind of approaching and what we're accepting in terms of like our participation in the patriarchal system. So if as men we want there to be less men who die by suicide each year, we have to think about what kind of behaviors we're enforcing that lead men to take their own lives. We have to think about what kind of behaviors we're reinforcing that lead men to become addicted to substances, that lead men to be homeless, and I think a lot of that ties into the ways that we are both benefited, with the way that we benefit from the patriarchal society and the way that it impacts us as well.
One of the things I'm interested in is about how homophobia can be used as a form of gender policing. So I'm a queer person. I'm not just coming out there. I think everyone's aware of that. But anyway, but I was
going to say, if someone doesn't know, then they probably live under a rock.
Yeah, it's like, come on, how much more effort do I need to put into that? Yeah, so what I'd say is that growing up, the worst kind of cuss word, I'm using Americanisms now, but that you'd hear in the playground was something linked to gay, queer, pof, that kind of thing. And it was endemic. I mean, it's like an everyday thing people will say. And despite changes in attitudes, I would say is still like rampant in the playground, in school settings and beyond, if we're going to be honest. And what I'd say is obviously homophobia is particularly violent, obviously, and oppressive towards gay people. But it's also true, I would say most straight people are on the receiving end of some form of homophobia, particularly in their younger years, but at some point in their lives. Because homophobia is used as this, I've called it like the border guards of masculinity, because if you're seen to not get into enough fights, to not speak about women in a degrading enough way, also other random stuff like being seen as too studious or maybe not athletic enough, things like that, then it's like, why are you being such a puff? Why are you being so gay? Or if you talk about your feelings, so if you talk about depression, and other forms of mental distress, that's seen as, people will either say man up or they'll say, oh, you're a puff or something. That is so rampant. So I'm interested in your thoughts about how homophobia is used against straight men in order to violently coerce them into embracing unreconstructed masculine behaviors.
Yeah, I mean, so all of that really just ties into the way in which masculinity is a performance, right? And so throughout, for a lot of boys and men as well, from the day they're born, literally, there's all these behaviors that are like policed, and there's borders around to what you can do and what you can't do, and what is seen as, being kind of normalized for a straight man versus what perhaps may be more effeminized or seen as queer or gay. And there's so many different examples that relate to this. Like we were talking about this earlier, like I grew up playing basketball, absolutely love basketball. One of the things that's common in basketball and a lot of other sports as well is that when someone does something good, someone scores or whatever, you slap them on the bum. Like, that's pretty much normal. Yeah, well done, good job, quick pat on the bum. Like, that's normal. I do that now. I did that as a 13-year-old boy when I first picked up a basketball, happened to me and so forth. But I can't think of any other context, and that was normalized, right? But I can't think of any other context where that would be normal. So I just think about if one of my mates got a promotion, and if we're chilling at his flat or whatever, and he's like, yeah, I got a new job, I'm like, get up and well done, quick pat on the bum. I'll be like, bro, what are you doing? That's gay. Or even think about remember the trend when men started wearing pink shirts or pink colors or wearing skinny jeans and so forth, all these fashion trends, right? Or remember when metrosexuality was a thing, which basically meant that men did their eyebrows. Like previous to that, if a guy participated in something that was seen as slightly effeminate, then they were, these kind of homophobic terms were thrown around towards them. And the thing is, we didn't necessarily, as a straight man, we didn't necessarily suffer the violence of homophobia. It was just more about policing your behaviors around what is seen as straight or not. And I think that happens in so many ways, in both the extreme ways, but in the absolute, like, kind of minute, almost like overlooked, insignificant ways. That just ties into the fact that every day we're performing masculinity, and that shifts, like, in terms of cultures as well. So my background's Congolese. It's very normal if you're in Congo and in many other countries around the world, Nigeria, India, and so forth, where two guys, like, could walk down the street holding hands, and there's nothing, there's no reflection of their sexuality whatsoever. But here in the UK particularly, if you're walking down the street hand in hand with another man, then that's immediately sexualized, and you'll probably suffer some form of violence towards that. And so there's always these shifting kind of goalposts about what is seen as straight or gay or masculine or feminine, and every day we're just performing to it. And quite frankly, it's extremely exhausting.
I mean, why do you think violence does hang over much of the masculine experience in its current forms? It's just always there, particularly when you're younger. Mm-hmm. Violence is kind of a means to resolve conflicts of any description. Always, particularly when you're younger, it always seems quite close. It's like never that far away. There's always a bit of, it depends where you grew up. I mean, I grew up in Stockport, and there was always some form, not that far away, some form of violence, male violence. What is that? I mean, somewhat, you see, because obviously you get a biological essentialist perspective, which is, this is testosterone. This is what it's innate. It's innately tied up with the biological realities of being male. Now, again, just to avoid people getting annoyed, I don't believe this, and I'm speaking from a devil's advocate perspective. But it's important because I know lots of people will raise this and they'll bring this up. So what is it all about? Why do you think violence is so tied up? Because you and I don't believe it's innate. We don't think being a man is eternally doomed, that violence is always tied to that experience. It's just not true. So why do you think it's so ever present as things stand?
Well, it's socialization, and violence is one of the quickest ways to kind of impose upon other people and uphold your power. And usually, like, it goes back to the very basic kind of view that the person who's bigger and stronger gets their way. And I think that if we look at the way that we're socialized in society as men, the portrayals that are shown in the mainstream media and on social media as well, violence and aggression between men. I say this, like, in previous talks as well. It's normal to see two guys fighting. It's more normal to see two guys fighting than it is to see two guys kissing on whatever platform. And even myself as a straight guy, like, I have to check myself in terms of this, because there's been several times, I live in North London. There's been several times that I'm walking down the street, coming home from a late night, pre-lockdown, whatever it is, and I've seen, like, guys get into a fight. And I'm like, oh, here we go again. And it's just nothing new. I don't react to it. I don't think of anything of it. I just think this is normal. But then when I see two men holding hands or being affectionate, I'm like, wow, I'm not in a negative way, but I'm like, wow, I'm really interested. I'm really thinking about their story and, all of this, and how much bravery it is to be in that situation. And I think, hold on, that actually says a lot about how we're socialized. It says a lot about the way that we view what's normal and what isn't. Perhaps if we were more shocked at two men fighting, and we were less shocked at two men loving each other, perhaps that would be able to redress, the normalization of this violence. And I think a lot of it is largely due to socialization. And there's many examples around the world where, initiatives are being put in place where young boys are being socialized to express themselves away from violence and aggression, and more towards compassion and understanding and communication, something also we're not taught to do.
And also, I mean, if the biological essentialist view was true, then all men would just be violent. And obviously,
I mean, just literally, like, just all the time. But the thing is, and I say, and this is hilarious, right? And men know, It's always funny when I have these conversations, because when I have it just amongst men, like, there's a certain almost like honesty that isn't upheld when it's generally around other people. Men know who they can and can't pick a fight with. Like, if a man sees another man who's bigger, perhaps more athletic looking than themselves, they're likely not going to pick a fight. It's very, very rare. But if they see someone who they feel they can intimidate, then suddenly that's where the bravado comes out. And it's all very selective, and it's very performative as well. I just wish that more men would admit that. And it's funny, right? One of the things that I always get, because I speak quite a lot about quite open about vulnerability, masculinity, and so forth. I happen to be quite tall. Unfortunately, it's really not convenient for me. I don't enjoy it at all. But one of the things that when someone meets me in person is like they almost want to come with like a certain level of, I don't know, like trying to approach me about what I discuss. But the first thing they always say is, "Wow, you're really tall." And then that kind of like, they change the way they speak towards me as if being a particular height or something is related to being aggressive. And I'm like, okay, in my head, I'm thinking I may be tall, but I'm the last person who like would even get into a fight, because I'm literally thinking I don't want to ruin my outfit and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's all performative, really.
I mean, it's not just violence, is it? There's also, I mean, one example, you often get that phrase thrown around, I'll just say it, like dick swinging contest, where you get men trying to dominate a situation. I mean, sometimes you'll get it through men who maybe are academically inclined, and they try to prove their worth by dominating a conversation, trying to prove how intelligent they are, their knowledge, speak over people, particularly other women, but also other men who they're trying to show they've got higher status than. And there's also, I know there's this example of devil's advocate arguments. Men are far more likely to present themselves as the devil's advocate in the way I'm ironically doing in this conversation, but there's a purpose. There's a purpose to this conversation. That I'm not doing it for performative reasons. I'm doing it to tease out an argument. But it's true. You get this kind of, and it's men trying to, you get it. Mansplaining, obviously, is another example where I'm now mansplaining for those watching, but it's obviously where men particularly appear in the mentions of women on Twitter and try to patronizingly explain to them basic things which the woman is probably more than aware of. So, I mean, it's interesting is it's not just violence. Men find other means to often, because of their socialization, to try and prove they are of a higher status and they should be dominant in a particular social setting.
And that's the thing. It's like the way that we're socialized. We're told for you to be a man, a real man, quote unquote, that you have to be kind of dominant in all situations. You have to take the lead, you have to be strong, and so forth. And all of these kind of really result in men developing ego complexes, right? To the point where even when it's against their own interests, they still try to dominate and still try to kind of present themselves as the authority figure or the leading voice in a place where it doesn't really suit them. And you find this happening, especially on Twitter, like all the time, where you see guys trying to mansplain something to a woman, so for example, who wrote the paper or the article about something. And then the woman reveals it was me who wrote it, and they still try to argue. That happens so many times. And I'm just like, come on, it's actually exhausting. But again, part of it is just that, that social dominance. And that ties in as well to, you think about it, patriarchy isn't just a system that exists in and of itself. It's also tied into capitalism, imperialism, and so forth. And so as men, we're constantly told that we have to be the breadwinners. We have to show that we're worthy suitors and all of that. And so if you think about, the guy who drives the flashy car, the guy who, is overly materialistic on the social medias, or the rappers, or whoever it is, these are all manifestations of patriarchy, the intersection of patriarchy and capitalism and imperialism as well.
A common kind of response often to men talking about how masculinity can harm men is, it sounds a bit, it's framed, sometimes people say this on Twitter, where men go, what about the men? You get this often on International Women's Day. People go, when's International Men's Day? It's like, there is an International Men's Day every year. So Google next time. Anyway, but we live obviously in a country where the 1.4 million women suffer domestic violence each year, far more than the other way round. And for those who raise it, yes, there is obviously the phenomenon of the other way around, but it's almost always less sustained and less violent than men and women. Women are obviously, where we talk about 400,000 women suffer sexual assault a year, and that's without just talking about sexual harassment, which can be a daily experience for many women in this country. And then you get the fact that women are concentrated. Oh, well, then we get 90,000 women raped a year. Women concentrated in the lowest paid and most insecure work. Women still doing the vast bulk of unpaid labor in the house, whether it be everything from cleaning to raising children. I mean, how do that's what people say. It's like, well, come on, how can we ever talk about men being evicted when actually it's men remain the dominant gender who are oppressing women and benefiting directly from the privilege of being men?
I mean, I think a lot of the times when men bring up the "what about men" issues, it's usually to silence women and to silence, people of other genders from speaking out about their oppression. I think there's valid conversations to be had about what men's experiences are, but never at a point where, it's on like International Women's Day and something, and they're saying, well, what about International Men's Day? When an International Men's Day exists. And then when that day comes around in November, like these same men who are saying, well, what about Men's Day? They remain silent, And so I think it's just really a silencing tactic. But all of these issues, even as well, it's funny because when we speak about men who are victims of whether it's violence or also sexual assault at the hands of other men or at the hands of women as well, they even get ridiculed. There's very few platforms that kind of have these conversations, and there's many occasions where if a man goes to the police station to report that they've been assaulted by perhaps their wife or something, like it's not taken as seriously. And so I think that we have to kind of really stop being contradictory and hypocritical. I'm saying that these guys who talk about it have to stop being hypocritical and actually raise the issues that they're passionate about without trying to silence women, because it's a continuum. Like the two issues are linked, and so if we're trying to speak over each other, we just end up kind of like clashing and not really resolving anything, which has been what's been happening for goodness knows how long.
A lot, it's often, well, not easy, but we can have these discussions about the nature of toxic masculinity and how it's harmful and just objectively harmful. But there are lots of young men in this country in settings where the expectation is to behave in a certain way, otherwise your life is made hard or significantly harder. It's not like lots of younger men are doing it for a laugh. As you say, it's socialization, and socialization is often a very oppressive and coercive thing to go through. So how do we get, if there are lots of younger men in settings where the milieu they're in, cheeky little French word there, but the settings they're in make it very hard to defy those expectations, precisely because they themselves fear they are more likely themselves to be a target. So what can actually happen? What can younger men maybe watching or listening to this, you think, well, this is all well and good, but given the situation I'm in, like these expectations, I don't like them, but they are very dominant and strong in the environment I'm in. So what can you do to change? What would you say to those younger men?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. And this is also an issue that I talk about with the young men that I do workshops with in schools and so forth, that it's first about understanding what created the environment that you're in, why those expectations exist, right, and what you can do about it. And no one's saying that to go out there and completely change everything at once. But I think within our own kind of circles, within our own private spaces and the friendships that we have, that's where we can begin to challenge some of the things, some of the toxic things that are normalized in terms of like our masculine expectations and behaviors as well. And I think if you challenge things within the personal spaces first, then it begins to impact on the wider issue. And so, I grew up like on a council estate in North London. Like I know what it's like to be in those environments where you're more at risk of being, you're more at risk of harm if you are seen as vulnerable rather than if you're seen as like being toxic, right? And so for me, I say it's about intelligently managing those situations. How do you address the issues within your own private spaces as well, and in your own local community? But also, I think like there has to be a certain element of realism in terms of how we navigate the world and how we navigate these spaces. Like I tell people to, as much as I tell people to, to not be violent and not be aggressive, I also tell people to, learn martial arts, for example, if they're physically able, or have some form of self-defense. Not because you're going to attack anyone, but more so, unfortunately, we still live in a world that we have to navigate these kind of dual realities. And I think, especially in terms of like from a martial arts perspective, is that I started training Muay Thai a few years ago. One of my close friends is an instructor, and it's so funny. So before I started training, I was like, yeah, I'm all right. I can fight. And it's actually hilarious because when I started training, I realized that through martial art, it's all like fighting is actually the last possible resort. It's all about conflict resolution and how you can get out of that situation, because you don't want to use the physical aggression. It's all about self-control and conflict resolution. And actually, like, I've never had an issue since, and I'm sure that other people would maybe have or have not have issues. But I think that empowering yourself with those skills allows you to navigate the reality of the world, a lot differently. And unfortunately, we're not yet at the peaceful, progressive world that we want to all live in. But it's like, until we get to those stages, what can we do in the meantime to empower ourselves whilst also making change within our communities? And I think so often that people just say, well, this is just the environment that I'm in. There's nothing I can do about it. When in fact, there's a lot of people doing amazing things within those environments as well that can be supported.
Just a couple of other things in this really fascinating book everyone needs to read and buy. So you debunk myths about masculinity. Men are logical and women are emotional. That men are sexual beings and women aren't. That men think about sex all the time and women don't. So just want to talk about those pervasive ideas that exist about being a man and being a woman.
Yeah, I mean, these are things that we, again, largely are socialized with. And also in terms of that socialization, it becomes like something that we internalize and almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? But the whole men are logical argument is hilarious, because when your when your favorite football team loses, you're upset for the whole week. Like, do you know what I mean? That is not a rational or logical thing to do. And actually, there was a research that showed that domestic violence went up on the days that the male partners' football teams lost. So imagine the absolute irrationality of your favorite football team losing, and then you go and taking out on your partner. And so those kind of decisions there just can't be rationalized. They're not logical at all. And I mean, that's just like one very kind of like small example, but I think there's so many different ways in which it impacts our everyday life. And all of these myths are myths that we're told from a young age, again, to kind of put up those borders around masculine expectations and toxic expectations that socializes us into becoming these things that we don't even recognize. And when you get to a certain stage or a certain level of understanding, you realize that, you're not the man you're supposed to be. And I quote Martin Robinson's book there as well, because he writes about being socialized in a way that this isn't even who I am. And I think a lot of men have a reckoning where they come to the point, or hopefully have a reckoning when they come to the point where it's like, well, I've been following my friends and people around me for so long. Like, who am I to myself? What are my feelings? What are my emotions and so forth? And that's a conversation that a lot of men need to have.
In chapter 5, you talk about gender fluidity. I think this is really interesting because Britain is such a burning skip when it comes to the issue of trans rights and gender non-conformity. To the extent now where anyone who knows trans people knows that trans people are talking about how they want to leave the country because the environment is just so hostile, and there is essentially this radicalized cult which is very entrenched and has become radicalized online. And I think there was an article actually recently by a brilliant journalist called Katie Baker, which looks at the parallels between anti-trans people who are radicalized online and men's rights activists, this kind of like red pill kind of thing. And they go through these online rabbit holes, and they're often emotionally vulnerable people exploited by, people radicalizing. But what you talk about is you talk about your Congolese background, and in Congolese culture, how gender fluid or trans people were held to a higher status in society and seen as more spiritual beings. So what does that tell us? Because obviously gender nonconformity actually expresses itself in lots of different cultures in lots of different ways. Thailand is one example as well, but there's lots of other cultures. So what does that teach us about the nature of gender, and gender not being this really fixed thing, which often it is?
So we're often told that, like, in terms of transgender identity or sexual identity, whether it's like queer or gay identities, that these things are not normal. And often that's told from quite a fundamentalist, like, religious perspective. And so my example in terms of including how gender was conceived and sexuality was conceived in these pre-colonial, indigenous, particularly African, global South societies, was to actually, like, give people examples of the way that identities were perceived before this Western global hegemony kind of took over. And the way that we see, whether it's trans identities or queer or gay identities now, particularly from an African context, is largely as a result of the colonial powers that enforce certain rules upon us. And so I use the example of the Congo cosmology or Congo spiritual system, where it is believed that in each person there's a balance of both masculine and feminine energies, and you find your person who balances you in terms of their masculine and feminine energies. These are things that were upheld in traditional societies, but when Congo, for example, was colonized by Portugal and colonized by Belgium, these were completely uprooted and eviscerated and replaced with more kind of religious, fundamental Catholic beliefs that said, a man is a man, and a man now shall not lay with a man, and a woman shall not lay with a woman, etc., and completely abolished these ideas of, like, gender and sexual fluidity. And so I think those examples help us to understand and conceptualize that the worlds that we're trying to create are actually worlds that have existed, right? And how do we then move forwards in a way that balances what we knew then with what we know now? And I'm not saying that, especially in Congo, even back then, that everything was perfect. But I'm saying that there's different ways of, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's different ways, particularly, like, to understand, our lived realities and our humanities as well. In the Native American tradition, like, there's up to 5 genders that are conceived, or the two-spirit people, for example. And these are people who are held in high regard. So I think we don't have to. So I say a lot of these examples for people to be able to get their heads around different cultures, different places in time, to understand what things were like, and that the fact that wherever we're born into, whatever families we're born into, a lot of the times it's just it's a lottery. It's a lottery. And so you could have been born into a time and a place where the things that you oppose are actually very normal. And so this kind of understanding of sexual fluidity and gender fluidity, in my understanding, in my ancestral understanding as well, is a lot more normal than we perceive it to be. And especially if you want to add in, like, I'll just go on a little bit, the nuance of, this kind of perception that there's an inherent maybe connection between blackness and homophobia. A lot of these things are espoused out there in terms of, like, black people being, more homophobic. And actually, in terms of, like, black cultures, pre-colonial black cultures and pre-colonial and pre-Western invasion black identities, queerness, sexual fluidity, and gender fluidity were normal. They're not just normal, but they were revered. And so it's like, how do we understand our histories, knowing that so much of it has been erased by the colonial powers, and how do we bring those erased histories into our modern lived realities as well?
Finally, we're going to leave on a high. I mean, the point that you obviously go at pains to make clear is masculinity and patriarchy are not one and the same. And obviously, masculinity is a fluid, dynamic thing, for want of a better word. But in your conclusion, you lay out, very much linked to that, 10 courses of action, basically, to create a radically new masculinity. So just give us a basic flavor of, a kind of, so we've not just analyzed here, so we have a kind of constructive way forward. What are the just basic sorts of things you think are the ways to combat this toxic form of masculinity and create a new form of masculinity that isn't based on the subjugation of women, it's not based on violence, not just against women, but against those deemed to deviate from the masculine norm?
So, I mean, firstly, like the reason why I wanted to include that, because there's a lot of amazing books out there on this issue, but then what often happens is you get filled with all this information and you don't know what to do next. And so I always kind of feel like what happens at that stage is when you don't know what to do next, the almost like automatic response is to revert back to the roots and patterns that you were kind of the cycle that you were stuck in. And so what I was trying to do is trying to like give some ideas about how people can empower themselves, right? In the absence of having perhaps political power or systemic power, what you can do in your own personal life and in your own communities and families to try and transform the way that people think about gender and sexuality as well. And so one of the things I say is journaling, right? I think journaling is incredibly powerful. I recommend everyone, but particularly boys and young men, to journal, because that's something that we're socialized away from. Journaling or keeping a diary is almost like completely effeminized. If you think about every pop teenage high school movie where it's like, oh, you keep a journal, you keep a diary, it's almost seen as something that young girls do and not like grown men. But actually, it's a brilliant tool for reflection, and that whole reflective process allows you to become more in touch with your emotions, more in touch with your thoughts and your feelings as well. And I think for a lot of us men, we're socialized to think away from that. And it's not that we aren't reflective, it's just that we're not told the benefits of it. And then those kind of like reflective processes help improve your relationships. It helps improve your mental health as well. And so if we're talking about why men die by suicide at a younger age, like those are some of the issues that, these are some of the tools that we can help address those issues. Another thing I try to propose is about men having, and I think this is a really important one, right? Men having more non-sexual intimacy, and particularly male intimacy with other men. And I think that's incredibly important, particularly for straight men, because a lot of the times we seek intimacy through sex, right? And that often leads us to having shallow sexual relationships which damage other people, but also damage ourselves. And so how can we create environments and spaces where we can be physically intimate, but in a non-sexual way? So that means like hugging, touching, embracing, all of those kind of things. And it's really interesting in the context of the pandemic, right, where we're not physically able to see each other and connect with each other, how much that has impacted us. Like, what has a year without touch done to us and our mental health? And I think the majority of us will agree that it's not had the most positive effect. And so, like, those are just some of the examples that, we can, I suggest for us to do in the absence of, political power, in the absence of systemic power, until we can put things in place in terms of like the education system or the mental health system and so forth. Like, what can we do in our own personal lives and in our relationships and in our friendships as well that can help improve that? Another thing that I suggest is therapy. I think therapy is so incredibly powerful and so incredibly important. Obviously, finding the right therapist is the key to that. But I think for a lot of men, we also don't have the space to actually speak about ourselves and speak about our issues. And a lot of us don't know where to go. And so therapy is a great solution, but it's obviously really expensive and difficult to access. So in the absence of therapy, what can you do? Like, can you create a space where you perhaps can have a friend or a mentor who you can talk to, someone local in your community? There's online, a lot of online spaces now. I know that Mind, for example, the charity, run online forums where you can anonymously speak with other people and talk about whatever it is that you may be going through. And so I think some of these things can actually have really significant impacts on our day-to-day lives, rather than us waiting for them to include it in, the education system or to change policies. There are things that we can do. There's things that you can do after you finish reading this book to then empower yourself in your day-to-day life.
JJ, it's been a massive honor, and I really do recommend people getting themselves a copy of Mask Off, Masculinity Redefined. It's such a crucial topic that we need to discuss, men need to discuss.
Thank you.
And you do it so brilliantly and eloquently, and it's so important that we have this discussion debate, which this book will provoke and help nurture. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
thanks for having me.
It's a big honor. Cheers.
All right, wonderful. Take care.
We're never going to succeed in radicalizing politics and doing what must be done on behalf of the many if we do not challenge the dominance of the establishment media with our own media. So support Owen Jones's team on Patreon.